The bells of St. Albans tolled thrice before dawn, but Margaret had not slept. Her breath clung to the frost-paned window, and she barely noticed how the chill bit through her linen sleeves. Her fingers bent with age, and prayer clutched the edge of the shutter. In the distance, the torchlights flickered across the abbey path where two riders had just dismounted. They came not with haste, but with quiet purpose, solemn sort of urgency that pierced her chest like a whisper from heaven. One bore a seal of the crown, the other she could not yet see, but something in the gait of the horse made her limbs stiffen. Behind her, the small hearth had long since died out its last breath of smoke, curling into the rafters. Her daughter Eleanor slept in the corner on a cot of straw, and wool her young breath slow and undisturbed. Margaret had not the heart to wake her not yet. 7 years. She murmured not to herself, but to the wooden cross mounted beside the hearth. And now they come. The door knocked once, and the sound was not loud, but final. Margaret opened it before they could knock again. Sir Harold Ashcombe stood there, grey-bearded and broad-shouldered despite the years. He removed his glove and held out a letter bound in deep crimson wax. The seal, unmistakably royal, bore the lion and crown. Margaret of Langford, he said, not cruelly, but with the tone of a man who had known both bloodshed and consequence. You are summoned to Westminster. Margaret's hands did not tremble. She took the letter, nodded once, and stepped aside to let him enter. The other man, younger, stood silent at the threshold, eyes downcast as though the wind itself bore witness to what was yet unspoken. Eleanor stirred in the corner. Mother, she whispered, voice caught between sleep and unease. Margaret did not answer immediately. She crossed to the hearth and placed the unopened letter on the mantel just below the rosary beads left behind by a husband she had buried 2 winters prior. Then she turned. There is no more time to hide, child, she said quietly. Pack what you need. The girl blinked, still unsure whether she dreamt. We leave before sunrise. The journey to Westminster took 3 days beneath a brittle winter sky. The fields lay bare, and the hedgerows were silvered with hoarfrost. Margaret rode in a small cart behind the knights, her knees covered in old wool, her hands clutched around a satchel that held not coin but relics, a worn comb of her husband's, to a rosary carved of yew, a ribbon from her son's christening, gown. Her mind did not idle. Each mile pulled her closer to the court, yes, but also to the memory of her son Edmund, accused of treason 7 years ago, hanged without proper trial, buried not in church ground but somewhere unnamed in the North Country. She had not seen his face since the day they took him from the priory. They claimed he conspired with Lollards, with foreign merchants, with God knew what. But Margaret remembered him as he was a boy who prayed before eating, who copied Latin verses in candlelight, who once carried a wounded bird 3 miles just to see it healed. What mother forgets such things? Now they summoned her. The Queen's advisers, it was said, had taken an interest in the case. A new court faction, one whispering of old injustices. Perhaps it was justice, or perhaps it was politics. She did not trust either. Westminster was ablaze with torches when they arrived. Candles flickered in every window, and the banners above the gatehouse snapped in the wind like old quarrels brought again to life. Margaret was taken to a small guest chamber near the chapel, and a woman, in mourning grey, brought her broth and bread. You are to be seen after none. The woman said, eyes averted. Margaret sipped the broth. It tasted of rosemary and onion, but no salt. She slept little. When the hour came, she was led not to the throne room, but to a narrow gallery overlooking the cloister. There, seated upon a bench carved with lions' heads, was Lord Julian Wellesley, the Queen's confessor. He was younger than she expected, with sharp features and dark eyes. His robes bore the mark of the Cambridge Order scholars who favoured ink over blood, though they served the crown with equal fervour. "You are Margaret of Langford," he said. She inclined her head. "You knew Edmund of Langford. I bore him in pain, raised him in love, and buried him in shame," she said. "I knew him well." Lord Julian studied her for a moment, as one studies a page that might be both scripture and indictment. New testimony has come forth. A clerk, recently deceased, left confession that your son was falsely named. There is consideration now for pardon and posthumous absolution. But the Queen requests more than records. She wishes to know the soul of the man. Margaret's voice, when it came, was steady. He was a child who prayed for birds and men alike. He feared foxes, but not darkness. He helped bury his father without being told. If that is not soul, my lord, then I have no more to give you. Julian said nothing, only nodded. She rose. If you pardon him, do not do it for me. Do it because it is right. If you do not, then let the shame rest with your court, not with a mother who loved him. She departed Westminster at dusk. No one stopped her. No fanfare, no parchment, no public absolution. But something had shifted. That night, beneath the stars near the hedgerow, where the cart had broken a wheel, Margaret knelt in the frozen grass. "Lord," she whispered, "if he be at peace, let the wind still." And for the first time in 7 years, it was utterly still. Takeaway: like the stream flowing around the stone, we are shaped not by the weight of our grief, but by how we let it pass through us. In Zen and in faith, peace comes not through forgetting, but through the quiet, unyielding act of release. Let the wind still, let the stream flow, rest now. The rain had come steadily since morning, a soft but ceaseless drizzle that misted the hedgerows and blurred the outlines of the distant oaks beyond the churchyard. It was All Souls' Day, and the air hung thick with damp earth, and the faint smell of candle wax drifting from St. Mary's Chapel in the village of Wyden. Thomas Everley stood by the headstone he had visited countless times in the past 11 years. His boots sank slightly into the sodden grass, and his cloak was dark with moisture, though he seemed unaware of the cold seeping through. Before him lay the grave of Anne Everley, his wife, his sorrow, his memory. The letters on the stone had faded some. The mason's hand had been a good one, yet even stone could not hold against time as memory did. Her name, once so full upon his lips, now remained mostly in the silence of thought and the echo of dreams. Behind him, the old vicar moved through the rows, with his brass censer murmuring Latin prayers over each resting place, his breath curling like incense in the cold. But Thomas had little interest in prayer that morning. He had come, as he often did, to speak not to God, but to her. They say, time eases the ache, he murmured, kneeling with difficulty, for his joints no longer obeyed like they once had. but I find it only sharpens the silence." He laid the sprigs of rosemary on the stone her favorite always kept on the sill of their cottage window. The scent, when bruised by rain, brought her laughter back to him more swiftly than any photograph or word. Not even her letters kept in the wooden box above his hearth could summon her with such clarity. He lingered there long after the vicar's prayers had concluded, and when the bell rang for matins, he still did not move. It was not until a familiar voice, soft and aged, broke the damp stillness that he stirred. "Mr. Everleigh, shall I walk with you?" It was Margaret Hall, a widow of the village and keeper of the church linens. She had known Anne well and had visited the Everleigh cottage in those final weeks, bringing broth and reading scripture when Thomas could not bear to. He nodded and stood leaning slightly on the stick he refused to call a cane. They walked slowly, the rain softening to a fine mist. The path to the village wound between blackthorn and yew, and the crows overhead called to one another as if echoing some forgotten liturgy. "It's been a heavy season," Margaret said after some time, as though speaking to the weather more than to him. "Aye," Thomas replied. "In more ways than one." She paused, then said, "I saw you again last week, walking past the schoolhouse at dusk. You looked troubled." Thomas did not deny it. He had indeed walked there as he often did, circling familiar roads, as though the act might wear a groove deep enough to fall into and disappear. But that evening had been different. That evening she had returned not in a dream nor in a memory, but in a manner far stranger. "There are nights," he said carefully, "when I feel as though she is beside me, not merely in thought, but near, just beyond the veil, so to speak." Margaret did not mock him. She only offered a nod, quiet and understanding. "It is not uncommon," she said, "for the departed to linger where love remains unspent." They said little more on the road, for Thomas's thoughts were already elsewhere, drifting backward to a moment that had returned to him with startling clarity only days before. It had been late October when he last dreamt of her clearly. In that vision, Anne was not ill or wan, but younger hair tied back with a ribbon of violet, her cheeks flush with laughter. She had sat in the garden behind the cottage, sewing beneath the crabapple tree, just as she had in those summers before the coughing began. She did not speak in the dream. She merely looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that carried both welcome and farewell. And then she turned and vanished through the narrow gate at the far end of the hedgerow that in waking life had not existed. When he woke, his eyes were wet, and the pillow beside him held the faintest scent of rosemary. In the village inn that afternoon, Thomas sat alone near the hearth, watching the fire's low flame crackle against the wood. It was a quiet hour, the patrons few, and the smell of malt hung in the air alongside the faint sweetness of stewed apples. A young lad, no more than 16, approached with a cloth and cleared the table beside him. "Is it true, sir?" the boy asked hesitantly, "that ghosts come back when you think of them too hard?" Thomas turned his gaze slowly, the lines around his eyes creasing further. He had known the boy's father, a stonemason by trade, buried 2 winters past. "They come back," Thomas said, "when something in us still waits to be spoken." The boy seemed uncertain how to answer and turned away without further question, but the words remained echoing faintly beneath the beams of the old timber ceiling. That evening, Thomas did not light a fire in his hearth. Instead, he sat by the window, the shutters wide, watching the night deepen across the fields. The stars blinked slowly into view, and the wind moved the branches like hands through water. In the silence, he spoke aloud, once more not in grief, but in gentle acknowledgement. "Anne," he said, "I release you from the place I've kept you, not because I wish to forget, but because I wish to rest." There was no reply, no vision, no gust of wind or shift of candle, but within him something loosened, not vanished but softened. And that night he slept soundly, dreamlessly, without the ache that had accompanied him for so long. Take away love held too tightly becomes longing, but love released like a lantern, let adrift upon still water glows, with a peace that endures. Rest does not mean forgetting. It means allowing memory to breathe and the soul to settle like evening mist upon the fields. Let your lantern drift, let your heart be light. The bell of St. Martin's struck the quarter hour as young William Dane swept the stone path leading to the chapel. It was early spring, the season when the earth first shakes off its winter stillness with a whisper rather than a trumpet. The sun had barely risen above the tree line, casting long gold-tinged shadows across the churchyard, and the air still carried the faint memory of frost. Will's broom, fashioned from hazel twigs and bound with twine, scraped gently over fallen catkins and dust from the previous day's wind. He worked slowly, deliberately, as if each motion might offer more than cleanliness, something akin to clarity or peace. Though only 15, he bore a gravity uncommon in boys of his years. A few steps beyond the church gate, Reverend Aldwin watched from the lychgate hands clasped behind his back. The old cleric, well into his 70s, now had taken to rising before the sun, unable to sleep as deeply as he once did. He observed the boy with a quiet sort of pride, tinged faintly with concern. "You're early again, William," he said, his voice low but clear. Will straightened, brushing a smudge of dust from his sleeve. "Yes, Reverend. The wind was strong last night. I thought the path might need attention." Aldwin stepped closer, his boots crunching over gravel. He surveyed the boy's handiwork for a moment, then gestured toward the edge of the church wall, where a cluster of crocuses had begun to bloom despite the lingering cold. "You tend the earth as if it might answer back." Will offered a small smile, barely more than a flicker. "Sometimes it feels like it does." There was silence between them for a few moments, broken only by the cawing of jackdaws in the yews above the graveyard. Then Aldwin spoke again, more softly. "You're still dreaming of your brother." Will did not answer immediately. He bent down to gather a bit of bark that had come loose from the elm tree and set it neatly upon the compost pile at the wall's base. "Yes," he said at last. "Almost every night." 2 years had passed since George Dane's death in the Channel crossing. He had been 21, full of strength and restless ambition, volunteering for a merchant's vessel bound for Bordeaux. A squall off the French coast ended the voyage in wreck and silence. They sent a letter, nothing more. Nobody returned. George had always been the louder of the two, the one who climbed trees before breakfast and leapt fences just to feel the wind. Will had followed him as one follows a comet, dazzled, uncertain whether it would return again. Since his brother's passing, Will had not wept, not once. But his dreams carried George, often sometimes smiling, sometimes silent, but always just beyond reach, as if the waking world held no space for reunion. He told no one of these dreams save Aldwin. Later that morning, Will remained behind after the other boys had left their catechism. He sat at the back pew, broom across his knees, as Aldwin extinguished the altar candles. "You've been quieter of late," the old man observed, lowering the snuffer. Will ran his fingers along the worn handle of the broom. "It's the dreams, Reverend. He keeps walking toward me, but no matter how far I go, I cannot close the distance." Aldwin considered the words with a grave nod. "Do you remember the tale of Brother Peter of Whitcliffe?" Will shook his head. "Long ago, when the abbey at Whitcliffe still stood there, was a novice who wept each night for his lost sister. She had died in childbirth, and he carried such grief that even his prayers became knotted with sorrow. One evening, an old monk gave him this counsel: cease speaking to the vision and begin listening." Will looked up, brow furrowed. Aldwin continued. The boy did so, and that night for the first time the dream changed. His sister turned, looked upon him, and smiled. "You must live the years I cannot," she said, and after that he did. The boy sat very still. The tale had the shape of something he already knew but had not yet named. "Perhaps," the Reverend said gently, "your brother walks not to you, but through you." That afternoon, Will did not return home straight away. Instead, he followed the woodland path behind the vicarage, where bluebells had just begun to emerge in the softer earth. The sky had cleared somewhat, and shafts of sunlight reached through the canopy in scattered beams like cathedral windows drawn by nature's own hand. He came to the glade where he and George had once camped during a summer storm, sheltering beneath a hastily sewn tent and laughing until dawn. The clearing had changed thicker undergrowth now, and the trees taller, but the impression of memory lingered like an echo. Will sat upon the moss-covered stone that marked the glade's center, folded his hands, and closed his eyes. He did not summon his brother. He did not call out or plead or weep. He only sat listening to the wind moving through the leaves and the distant hum of bees amid the primroses. And there, in the stillness, something inside him shifted. Not erased, nor forgotten, but transformed. That evening, as the shadows lengthened across the village green and smoke rose from the chimneys of homes preparing for supper, Will took up his broom once more. He swept not only the chapel path, but also the stones near the vicarage gate, and finally the small lane leading toward the schoolhouse. With each movement he felt a softening within him, as though the very act of sweeping made space not just on the path but in the corridors of his mind. There was a quiet order in it, a rhythm that echoed the reverent hush of prayer. And that night, as sleep drew near, George came again, but he did not walk toward Will. Instead, he stood among the trees in the glade, smiling faintly, arms at ease. Then he turned slowly, unhurriedly, and walked on through the wood, disappearing not into darkness, but into light. Takeaway: when grief returns, as dreams do not chase the vision, instead, sweep the path within. Let memory pass like wind through woodland boughs. Stillness is not emptiness, but the space where healing begins. Sweep gently, listen deeply, and let the soul rest where footsteps fade into light. The hearth in the parlour room of Hawthorne Manor had long since burned down to a quiet bed of embers, yet Lydia Fairfax sat unmoving beside it, her fingers tightening slightly upon the folds of her evening shawl. The hour was late, and the sounds of the house once alive with the rustling of maids, the low voices of footmen, the light creak of polished floorboard shad, vanished into the stillness peculiar to large old homes after midnight. Only the wind remained winding itself about the eaves and whispering through the casement like a presence seeking entry. She was not afraid. No fear had long ceased to be her companion. What remained was anticipation, quiet, watchful, and oddly persistent. Tonight marked the 12th such vigil in as many months, always on the 12th of the month, always beginning at the same hour, always alone. Her eyes turned briefly toward the escritoire by the curtained window, where lay a sealed letter with her name written in a firm hand she had not seen in 6 years. Jonathan. It was the one he had given to the steward before boarding the mail coach, bound for Portsmouth, one that never reached the docks. The letter, like its sender, had disappeared for 5 years before it was returned anonymously in a parcel from Vienna bearing no note save the address. Its journey was as mysterious as its sender's fate. In the letter, Jonathan Fairfax had not professed undying love or tragic apology. Instead, he had written of reconciliation of a mind unburdened, a conscience made clear, a heart at last ready to return. But the letter had come too late. His name had already been engraved in the family memorial stone by then, along with the date of presumed death at sea. Yet he lingered not in body, but in thought. In the hours before sleep, in the unexpected toll of the parish bell, in the scent of wet stone after rain. And most strongly in this room at this hour. It had been the parlour they used in winter, when the other wings of the house were closed. The same room where Jonathan had once sat with their solicitor to speak of their estate's debts, where Lydia had served tea from her grandmother's porcelain set, and where just 1 week before his disappearance, he had taken her hand and said, in a voice heavy with weariness, "We must lose everything before we remember what was truly ours." At the time, she had not understood. Now she repeated those words often in her mind as though they might offer a key to a locked door within her. The candle on the mantelpiece flickered low, its flame bending slightly toward the north wall, where the old tapestry of St. George and the dragon hung. Lydia's gaze followed it instinctively, though she had long since ceased expecting such movements to carry meaning. The house settled around her. Somewhere in the lower corridor, a shutter thumped softly. Wind again. And yet, this night felt different. The fire dimmed further. The shadows across the floor grew long and familiar, like old acquaintances with stories to tell. Lydia rose not abruptly, but with the grace of habit, and walked to the escritoire. She did not open the letter. She had never opened it. There had been temptation, of course. She had once brought a paper knife to the seal and held it there trembling, but something within her had recoiled not out of dread, but of strange reverence, as though the letter was less a message than a testament. Instead, she retrieved her journal from the drawer beneath and sat again by the fire, its last glow warming her slippers and the hem of her gown. She opened to the page she had marked and began to write. March the 12th. He came in the early hours, I believe, not in form but in feeling. I felt his presence as surely as one hears a name in a crowd or the stirring of a curtain in a still room. He did not speak, but I knew he lingered. She paused, her pen hovering. Then slowly, she set it aside. In the spring after Jonathan's disappearance, Lydia had journeyed to the coast herself. She had walked the same path he might have taken to the wharf. She had even spoken to the harbour master, who remembered nothing of such a gentleman. It was in that same town that she had met an old widow named Agnes, who sold lavender from her garden and brewed the strongest tea Lydia had ever tasted. The old woman had spoken unprompted of how the sea does not keep the dead as the land does. The sea, she said, keeps only the weight of what was left unsaid. It stirs it in the waves, carries it across nations, and leaves it behind in places no map can trace. Those words had stayed with Lydia, etched into her mind, as if spoken by the sea itself. The candle extinguished without warning. A breath of wind, sudden and sure, passed through the parlour. Lydia did not start. She stood and went to the window, drawing back the curtain. The garden was veiled in mist, the box hedges standing like guardians of old. She could make out the outline of the path leading down to the orchard, where she and Jonathan had once walked on his 35th birthday. He had spoken then of planting a new line of beech trees for the next generation. They had planted one, just one, before he vanished. That tree now stood half-grown, its bark, smooth its branches, tentative but strong. It had survived winters he had not seen, and somehow that brought her comfort. Lydia returned to the hearth. She did not relight the candle. Instead, she knelt beside the fire and placed a small piece of wood upon the embers. It caught gently, its light low but enduring. From a drawer in the sideboard, she withdrew a bundle of lettershire Own never sent. She placed them one by one beside the fire. The paper crackled as it met the flame, curling in on itself like petals in reverse bloom. As the last letter burned, Lydia spoke softly but clearly. I release the outcome. There was no vision, no voice, only stillness. And yet, she felt Eta loosening as though the house itself sighed. Later, as she prepared for bed, Lydia paused beside the escritoire. She laid her hand upon Jonathan's letter, then at last lifted the seal. Inside, the parchment had yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but legible. The words were brief. Forgive the years I wandered. I see now I was seeking not escape but return. If this reaches you, let it mean I found my way. She folded the letter and returned it to its place. Then she blew out the final taper. Takeaway. When one clings to a desired outcome, the soul remains bound by invisible chains. But when expectation is released, peace flows in like light through an unshuttered window. To seek resolution is natural, but to accept the mystery is divine. Let the outcome go, let the spirit rest, and find the grace of stillness where answers once stood. The mist had begun to lift from the fields of East Bramble Hollow, revealing the skeletal silhouettes of the hedgerows and the outlines of the old yew trees that bordered the property. George Harrow stood at the threshold of his cottage mug in hand, gazing across the garden as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the silver fog. Though his frame remained upright and lean, there was a weariness to his stance, as if some internal tether had long been pulled too taut and now frayed quietly beneath the surface. The garden, which once burst with marigolds and sweet peas under the careful hand of his late wife Eleanor, had grown unruly in the years since her passing. Ivy curled around the trellis, and the flower beds stood mostly empty, save for the stubborn hellebores that returned each winter. He had left them that way, unconsciously, as though tidying them might disturb something sacred and unseen. George took a sip of his tea and stepped onto the dew-damp stones, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. It was a sound that marked time better than any clocker sound unchanged for decades heard by generations of Harrows before him. As he wandered toward the small bench beneath the plum tree, he caught himself looking toward the stone sundial where Eleanor used to sit with her ledger tracking the herbs and roots she cultivated for the villagers. Her writing, always neat, still filled the pages of her garden journals, which he had never dared to discard. They remained in the drawer beside her old spectacles, untouched but not forgotten. In recent months, Eleanor had returned to him, not in body, of course, but in image. She came not with words but with the silence of presence. He would feel her when the house fell too still, or when the light slanted just so through the lace curtains. At first he attributed it to grief's cruel echo, but the recurrence, the familiarity, the gentleness, it unsettled him, not because it frightened, but because it lingered beyond the realm of thought. It was not simply remembrance. It was as though she, or some essence of her, hovered just at the edge of consciousness, patiently waiting. On the third Thursday of every month, George attended a modest gathering at the home of Reverend Alcott, the local curate, whose theological lectures leaned more toward compassion than fire and brimstone. The Reverend, himself a widower, hosted a supper for those of the parish who bore sorrows without fanfare. They called it, without irony, the Thursday Circle. That evening, as firelight danced across the timber beams of the old rectory, George listened as old Mrs. Penelope Trigg recounted a dream she'd had of her departed brother. He had appeared, she said, by the old pond behind the schoolhouse, fishing rod in hand, laughing just as he had in boyhood. He didn't speak, she said softly. But he looked back at me as if to say, "There's nothing left to forgive." The room was silent for a moment. The words hovered tender and unresolved. Then Reverend Alcott leaned forward and spoke in his measured cadence. "We often mistake the thought for the thinker. The mind generates images, but the soul listens. When one becomes too entangled with the thought, one forgets that we are not the river but the witness of its flow." George nodded faintly, though he did not speak. He understood now that something in him had indeed become entangled not with Eleanor herself, but with the thoughts surrounding her absence. Returning home that evening, George lit a taper and sat in the parlor with one of Eleanor's old journals resting on his lap. He did not open it. Instead, he watched the candle flicker the flame, casting a trembling glow on the wall where their wedding portrait once hung. He had removed that portrait 3 years ago, placing it face down in the linen chest at the foot of their bed. The image of her smile, so full, so vivid, had begun to feel like a wound. But tonight something urged him to retrieve it. He climbed the stairs slowly, the old wood groaning beneath his step. The bedroom smelled of lavender sachets, long dried and dust softened by time. He opened the chest and lifted the frame, brushing a layer of cloth from its surface. Eleanor looked back at him, unchanged. Her gaze bore the same calm determination, her hands folded over a sprig of rosemary she had held just for the photograph. It had been her favorite symbol for remembrance, she said, but also for clarity of thought. George placed the frame atop the dresser and sat at the edge of the bed, the candlelight now illuminating the small embroidered pillow she had stitched in their second year of marriage. "In stillness, there is knowing," it read. The following morning, George made a quiet resolution. He would no longer flee the thoughts of Herna, would he become them. Instead, he would bear witness, as the Reverend had said. Observe but not become. He rose earlier than usual and returned to the garden this time, with shears and a pair of gloves Eleanor had once bought him, but he'd never used. He trimmed the ivy from the trellis, cleared the weeds from her herb bed, and uncovered the small plaque she had placed near the rosemary bush. The inscription read, "May this place yield what heals and what remembers." That afternoon he brought the ledger from the drawer and turned its pages slowly, reading her notes on valerian root chamomile tea and tinctures for nervous melancholy. The entries were practical, meticulous, and written with affection for the land she loved. Near the end, he found a passage dated 2 months before her passing. "George frets when he's alone too long. I've told him that the mind is a trickster spinning shadows into shapes. He smiles, but I know he hears me. He always hears me." He closed the book and let his hand rest upon its cover. That evening, Eleanor did not appear in the house knot in the curtains, nor in the corners, nor in the sound of creaking floorboards. And oddly, he felt no absence. The weight had lessened not by departure, but by transformation. He was not alone, but nor was he haunted. He was accompanied not by thought, but by memory accepted, received, and gently let go. Takeaway. When we become entangled with thought, we lose sight of the one who observes. But peace does not dwell in the ceaseless clamor of the mind. It waits in the silent space between recognition and release. Do not wrestle with memory. Do not become the thought. Be the witness, and in bearing quiet witness find the stillness in which healing begins. In the shadowed lanes of Lower Ashcombe, the village's earliest risers were the swallows darting beneath the thatched eaves before the church bell tolled its first peal. It was a place where time moved gently, where generations watched the same mist rise over the vale and the same sun dip behind the downs. Yet for Harriet Linton, time had recently begun to blur. She stood by the latticed window of her cottage, wrapped in a shawl of plum-coloured wool, a gift from her sister Agnes, nearly a decade past. It was just before dawn, and already the weight of another sleepless night pressed upon her shoulders. She did not weep, nor sigh, nor speak. Her face bore the placid solemnity of one who had grown used to silence, not as a visitor, but as a tenant. For weeks, perhaps months, her thoughts had not been her own. The image of a Manasseh familiar once cherished had taken residence within the corridors of her mind, Thomas Ashcroft. It was a name she no longer heard aloud, but which echoed with maddening clarity in her private hours. He had been, in a sense, a mistake, not in sentiment, but in the course he had chosen. A barrister by training, but a gambler in truth, whose debts had forced him to flee to the north, leaving behind not only scandal, but Harriet. They had not spoken in 24 years. Yet here he was again visiting her in the quiet, in her dreams, in the solitary hours between dusk and sleep, when the mind begins to unravel its day and drift upon hidden currents. Each time he appeared, it was the same, standing at the edge of a garden she did not recognize, never speaking, always watching. It unsettled her, not because of anger that had long cooled, but because of the precision of the vision, the texture of his coat, the weariness in his posture, the pale scar along his left brow. She had begun to question her mind, and so she sought counsel. Dr. Felix Craythorne was not a physician in the modern sense. His practice, tucked behind the ivy-covered wall near the rectory, leaned more toward philosophy and quiet observation than medicine. He had served in India during his youth and studied the ways of both Western and Eastern inquiry. Locals considered him eccentric, but not unkind. On that mild Thursday, Harriet found herself seated upon a cushioned stool in his drawing room, hands folded, gaze fixed on the delicate ticking of the brass clock on the mantel. "You say he returns nightly?" Dr. Craythorne asked, pouring her a cup of barley tea. "Yes," she replied, her tone soft. "But not as one remembers a face or voice. It is as though my thoughts do not arise but arrive." He regarded her closely, his fingers steepled. "And do you engage with the image?" "Number I only observe." He nodded slowly, then drew from a drawer a small object wrapped in silk, a bamboo flute. It bore markings along its side, faint characters of an unfamiliar script. "This," he said, offering it to her, "was given to me by a monk near Calcutta. He told me, 'Your breath is the rope that binds or frees your mind. Play it not to make music, but to feel the breath move through you.'" Harriet took it hesitant at first. She brought it to her lips, exhaling lightly. The sound that emerged was low and waveringless, a note more, a whisper. She tried again. This time the breath steadied. Dr. Craythorne smiled faintly. "Now when he returns, breathe. Do not fight the thought. Let it pass as wind through hollow reed." That night, Harriet did not lie in bed immediately. She sat by the hearth, flute in hand, candlelight, playing across the cracked spine of her father's Bible on the shelf above. The flame's movement seemed to mimic the flicker of her thoughts, restless but tethered. When she at last retired, she left the window slightly ajar, letting in the hush of the April air. The flute rested beside her pillow. And as expected, he came again. Thomas beneath the garden arch, dusk all around him, as he had each time before. But tonight, Harriet did not retreat. She remained still, listening inwardly, letting breath rise and fall through her like tide upon stone. He did not move, nor did she. And slowly, the image faded, not broken, but dissolved like mist drawn into sunlight. The following morning, Harriet walked to the edge of the village, past the weeping willow that shaded the pond and the stile that marked the path to Mill End. She felt lighter, not healed, but unburdened. The vision had not vanished, but its weight had altered. It no longer felt like a summons, but a release. She paused by the church gate, where Agnes waited with a basket of spring cuttings from the garden. "You look rested," her sister said, brushing a curl from her brow. "I breathed," Harriet replied, smiling faintly. Agnes, though puzzled, did not press. The years had taught her that not all matters of the soul bore easy explanation. They walked together through the green past Mr. Bede's orchard, where the first blossoms were appearing. A warm wind stirred the branches, and petals fell like drifting thoughts, unbound and soft. In the weeks that followed, Harriet took to playing the flute each evening before retiring. She made no song of it-only breath, slow and steady, exhaled into wood. The visions ceased. Or perhaps they merely ceased to hold her. And in their absence, new thoughts came, not of Thomas, but of old friendships, of the scent of her mother's kitchen, of the letter she once meant to write to her niece in Suffolk. It was not erasure, it was renewal. One late afternoon, as she sat in the garden with a shawl about her shoulders, Agnes brought out the old box of letters. Among them was one from Thomas, dated the year of his departure, but never opened. The seal, unbroken, bore the family crest. Harriet held it for a time, then she placed it upon the garden wall, where the wind took it gently and carried it to the ground. She did not retrieve it. Some things she now knew need not be read to be understood. Takeaway. When we cling to our thoughts, we become their captive, but when we let them pass through us like breath through reed, they lose their hold. Peace is not found in the absence of memory, but in the stillness with which we meet it. Breathe gently, let the vision fade, and allow the soul its quiet return to the present. The lane to Waverley House was lined with wych elms, their bare branches creaking faintly in the March wind. The gravel crunched beneath Edmund Rowley's boots as he made his slow approach, hands tucked behind his back shoulders, drawn with the stiffness of a man unaccustomed to rest. He had returned that morning from his brief stay in Bath, a retreat intended for health of the mind more than of the body, though neither had felt particularly improved. The house built by his grandfather, and still bearing the carved motto Veritas Vincit above its lintel, looked much the same as when he left it. The ivy had not yet climbed far past the third casement, and the chimneys smoked faintly against the pewter sky, but inside, Edmund knew something had changed. He entered through the east door where the flagstones were worn and familiar. The housekeeper, Mrs. Grafton, met him in the hall with a slight curtsy and her usual composed expression. She said nothing of his absence, nor of the letters that had arrived in his absence. Instead, she handed him a sealed envelope, thick and cream-coloured, the script unmistakably belonging to Mr. Robert Albridge. Edmund did not open it. He climbed the stairs and entered the library, the room most suffused with memory. This was where his father had read aloud from Cicero during Edmund's schooling, where his brother Charles had stood beside the hearth in the winter of '64 and delivered his bitter denunciation before leaving for France, and where Edmund himself had once, many years ago, written a letter he never posted to the woman who had once meant all the world to him. Clara. He walked to the desk, laid the new letter beside the old, and sat down heavily in the worn leather chair. Outside, the wind gathered force, rattling the window panes and carrying with it a faint scent of ash and loam. It stirred within him a memory he had not invited, a particular afternoon in the spring of 1867, in the garden behind the Ashbourne Rectory, where Clara had lived with her uncle the vicar. She had spoken with such candour then, her eyes bright with certainty. Forgiveness, she had said, is not for them, Edmund, it is for you. Like putting down a heavy cup that burns your hand and never seems to cool. He had not listened. Pride wounded and fierce had shut his ears. He had nursed his resentment like a candle kept alive in wind, feeding it, shielding it, allowing it to shape his very nature. And now she was gone. He had learned from Albridge's last letter that she had died in January quietly of a fever. She had married, moved to Northumberland, and borne 2 children. Her life long severed from his had completed its circle, while he remained suspended in the bitterness of what might have been. Edmund rose from the chair and crossed to the hearth. He had once shattered a porcelain teacup there in anger on the very day Clara had sent back the signet ring he'd given her. The fragment still remained in the crack of the floorboard, pale and sharp, though dulled now by time. He knelt slowly, his knees protesting, and prized the piece loose. It was no longer a weapon, but a relic. He held it in his palm for a moment, then carried it to the window and opened the latch. The wind tugged at his collar. With a breath, he let the shard fall into the ivy below. Later that day he walked to the village, passing the orchard where he and Charles had once raced in their youth, laughing as they leapt the fence beside old Mowbray's field. He passed the mill pond, now half drained, and the churchyard where his mother lay beneath a carved cross of Cornish granite. At the church steps stood Reverend Gilders, a younger man than Edmund remembered, though his bearing bore the weight of old convictions. The two men nodded in mutual recognition, and Edmund paused. "I hear," the Reverend said gently. "You've returned to us, Mr. Rowley." "For now," Edmund replied, "though I find the place speaks to me more than the people do. That is often the case with the wounded," Gilders said without irony. "The stones remember." Edmund looked past him to the yew tree that shaded the path to the chapel's side door. "I've carried a name with me," he said. "Longer than I ought to have. Not hers, but my own, altered by the things I never said and the peace I never sought." The Reverend considered this with a quiet nod. "If it is forgiveness you seek," he said, "it may not come as a voice or gesture. It may simply be the silence that remains when the need for vengeance departs." Edmund said nothing more. He returned to Waverley by a different route, taking the lower path that curved beside the brook. The sky had begun to clear, and the first hint of warmth stirred in the breezier, promise of spring rather than spring itself. That evening, as the candles flickered low in the library, Edmund brought out the box of old letters, each one written in his own hand, but never sent. He did not read them. He merely fed them one by one into the fire. They curled, blackened and crumbled to ash, releasing nothing visible but something nonetheless unburdening felt in the spine, the jaw, the breath. When the last letter was gone, he returned to the desk, unsealed Albridge's envelope, and began to write a reply. Not to explain, not to regret, but to begin. Take away resentment is a fire fed by the hand that holds it. In clinging to what was unjust, we carry the wound beyond its infliction. But when the need for retribution falls silent, something softer takes its place. Stillness, not emptiness. Peace, not defeat. Put down the burning cup. Step forward, unburdened. Let the soul speak in the quiet that follows. The air above the headstones in Winford's churchyard hung damp and fragrant with late summer's decay. Old roses shed their final petals near the vicar's wall, and bees moved slowly between the last of the foxgloves, their hum low and unhurried. Standing among the graves, Miriam Denham held a bundle of dried lavender in one hand, and in the other a small folded envelope that bore no address. She was dressed in grey, as was her custom since her husband's passing 5 years before. Not widow's weeds exactly, but muted wool and muslin that suited her bearing serene, composed rarely altered by the season or the mood of others. The villagers had long respected her quietude, though they seldom knew the reason for it. The grave she stood before bore the name not of her husband, but of Philip Morton, a man she had known in youth, loved in silence, and lost long before age, granted either of them a second chance. Philip had died abroad, serving in the consular service in Tangier. News of his passing had reached her in the form of a clipped notice in the Times years after they had last spoken. By then, both had married others, and the soft thread that had once connected their lives had frayed and receded into memory. Yet she returned each year, always on the 1st of September, his birthday, to lay lavender at the family plot, where his parents and 2 elder sisters also rested. She did not visit as one haunted, nor as one tormented by what might have been. Rather, it was as if she performed an ancient rite, quiet and steady, known only to herself and to God. That morning had begun much like any other. The bells had rung from St. Helens at 7:30, and the kettle in Miriam's kitchen whistled before the sun fully reached the sill. She had brewed black tea and sweetened it with barley syrup, as her grandmother once had. Then, from the drawer beneath the dresser, she had taken out the small envelope, a blank one, containing nothing, and slipped it into her pocket. There was no letter inside. There never had been. Instead, the envelope served as a singular placeholder for all the things unsaid, the letters never written, and the words that even now refused to find shape. Philip had once asked her to elope. It had been late April of 1893, under the sycamore at Brantford Hall, after the final dances of the harvest supper. She had declined it not for lack of love, but for the weight of duty. Her father's illness had worsened her younger brother's, required her guidance, and the estate had already begun to slip under the burden of loans. "I cannot abandon them," she had said then, her voice steady, but her heart fraying at the edges. "I never asked you to abandon anyone," he replied, "only to believe that happiness might also be your duty." She had turned away that night, and though they exchanged letters for a year afterward, the tone changed, strained, brittle, full of politeness and omissions. Eventually, the letters stopped altogether. She had chosen the right path, she often reminded herself, but righteousness bore its own silence, and silence had become her companion. The churchyard was empty save for a blackbird on the low wall. She bent to place the lavender on the stone fingers, brushing the carved inscription worn faint by time and weather. There was no sentiment etched, only name and date, as though the family had deemed poetry too indulgent for a man who never married and spent most of his life abroad. She touched the edge of the gravestone and then, with deliberate motion, placed the blank envelope atop the lavender. "Let this be enough," she whispered. A breeze stirred her scarf. Returning home, Miriam passed the apothecary, where young Mr. Langley was arranging jars of dried herbs in the window. He greeted her with his usual courteous nod, but she did not stop to speak. Her gait, measured and upright, carried her onward down the cobbled lane past the bakery and back to Rosemere Cottage, her home for the last 17 years. Inside, the house was warm with the scent of beeswax and lemon oil, and the mantel clock ticked with a steady beat. She sat by the hearth and poured the second cup of tea she had brewed that morning, placing it across from her own, as she often did, an old habit, strange to others but comforting to her. That afternoon she opened the wooden box by the writing desk and took out a volume of poetry by Herrick. It had once belonged to Philip, inscribed, in a spidery hand, "To M.D. for courage, yet untold." She read 3 verses, not aloud, and closed the book. And then she wrote. Not a letter, not a confession, but a single sentence in her diary. "I do not regret the choice, but I miss the voice that made me question it." She set down the pen and folded her hands in her lap, allowing the late afternoon sun to spread across the floor, warm and slow, like an answer delayed but still received. Evening brought rain, a gentle patter upon the roof, and the soft scent of damp earth rising through the open sash window. Miriam stood once more, this time not to visit the past, but to tend to the present. She trimmed the lamp, lit the taper, and placed a hand briefly upon the back of the empty chair opposite her. Tomorrow there would be guests, the vicar's wife with her lemon cake, and her niece Marianne from Surrey, who had begun writing letters to a young man in Kent. She would smile, offer tea, and listen. And perhaps if asked, she would speak not of Philip, but of the importance of silence, and of the way lavender returns faithfully each year, whether it is called for or not. Take away longing when held gently becomes remembrance. We may not be able to change what was chosen, but we may choose how it lives within us. Let the unsent letter rest. Let the heart honor what passed with dignity, and trust that even in silence something faithful remains like lavender returning to bloom where it once grew. The morning rain had passed through Brentley-on-Wye like a silent procession, leaving the cobblestones darkened and glistening beneath the weak sun. Steam rose in thin curls from the mossy stone wall outside the parish school, where a dozen boys were bent over their slates, their breath still visible in the early chill. From his seat, by the south-facing window, Edward Linley could see them clearly, each bent head a symbol of industry, of futures still unformed and unbruised. But it was not the children he counted, nor their diligent scribbling that concerned him. It was the jar. On the corner of his desk stood a glass jar modest in size, with a pewter lid slightly dented on one side. Inside it were pebbles, smooth, pale things, each one gathered by his own hand over the past 3 months. There were 57 precisely, one for each day he had thought of her. Anna Fawley. The act had begun unconsciously. On the morning of her departure from Brentley, when she had left the cottage on Hilltop Lane and returned to Devon to care for her aging aunt, he had picked up a stone while walking along the canal path. A small oval thing, cool and pale as milk. He placed it in his pocket and thought nothing of it. The next day another, then another, and so the jar began. In the eyes of the village, Edward Linley was a man of sound character, unmarried, well-read, and modest in both speech and bearing. He had served as schoolmaster at St. Tate, Joseph's for 17 years, and few remembered a time before his quiet steps echoed through the wooden corridors. He was not cold, but careful, not severe, but self-contained. The sort of man who preferred the slow rustle of pages to the tumult of conversation. Anna had entered his life, not as a flame, but as a quiet draught of air, in a closed room bracing, surprising but subtle. She had come to Brentley for the summer, intending only to rest after years abroad, in her role as a governess in Vienna and then Paris. Her voice carried the softness of someone who had learned to speak after listening carefully. Her laughter was not frequent, but when it came, it felt like light falling on winter stone. They had met at the vicar's garden fete. She had admired the carvings on a wooden chess set he had helped whittle for the raffle. "You must be patient," she said, tracing the knight with one finger. "It takes a certain restraint not to rush the finishing." He had smiled then. "I find that the form reveals itself only after one has stopped trying too hard." They had spoken no more than that, but it was enough. Over the weeks that followed, they shared tea beneath the lindens behind the church. Sometimes she brought poetry in French, and he would read aloud while she corrected his accent. Once she gave him a copy of The Death of Ivan Ilyich with a pressed violet between its pages. He still kept it in the drawer of his desk. And then one day, in late August, she was gone. No farewell, only a note left at the vicar's with her apologies. Her aunt had taken ill. She would not return. Edward added the 58th pebble after the children left for the day. He chose it carefully from the dish by the window, rolled it between thumb and forefinger, and dropped it into the jar. The sound was soft, like rain against porcelain. He studied it a moment longer, then stood and reached for his coat. Outside, the sun had begun to descend behind the thatched rooftops, casting the fields in amber and rust. He walked without haste toward the canal path where reeds swayed gently and the water caught the colors of the sky. Each step had the rhythm of ritual. Near the bend in the path stood a bench weathered by time, but steady. It was there that he had first read to her aloud from Arnold's Dover Beach, her shawl drawn about her shoulders as the wind from the river stirred her hair. He sat. From his pocket he drew a small folded paper. It bore no address, only a sentence. I keep what I cannot say in a jar, and it grows heavier with peace. He did not write it to send. It was a kind of balm, a shaping of sorrow into something ordered. A woman passed on the path with her dog. She nodded in greeting. He returned the gesture, folded the note again, and slipped it into his book. Back home, he returned the jar to its place on the shelf, beside a sprig of dried heather and the old chess set. He did not intend to stop collecting, but the burden had begun to shift. The stones no longer felt like anchors. They were markers. Each thought a weight, once now a witness. He stood by the window listening to the church bell chime 7. Then he turned, lit the small lamp by the hearth, and opened the book of poetry she had once left behind. He read not aloud, not to remember her, but to keep her company in silence. Takeaway. Every thought we carry can become a stone light, or heavy depending on how we hold it. When sorrow is observed, not resisted, it begins to change its shape. Count your thoughts, if you must, but know that in time their weight may settle. What once bound the heart can become the quiet testament of love, endured and released. Let the stones remain, let the jar rest, and breathe gently where memory lives. The wind that swept over the hills of Dunsmuir carried the scent of peat smoke, and damp soil mingled faintly with the late blossoms of the hawthorn trees lining the footpaths. It was a wind that stirred memory, a wind that had in the quiet corner of Walter Breckenridge's mind come to resemble a kind of voice note, loud, not commanding but persistent, and low, like a bell tolling in the distance. Walter sat beneath the eaves of the old summer house at the edge of his property, his walking stick resting against the worn bench, a plaid blanket drawn over his knees. The summer house had once been a place of laughter music and spilled cider echoes of parties hosted by his late wife Eleanor during their younger years. Its paint was now peeling, and the trellis above it had begun to sag under the weight of wild honeysuckle, but the view remained. From there, one could see all the way to the stream that marked the old boundary of the Breckenridge estate, its water weaving through the rushes like silver thread in a tapestry. On that particular afternoon, as the clouds began to part and cast a milky gold across the fields, Walter watched the branches sway and listened not to the rustle of leaves, but to the silence between them. The mind, he had come to realize, was like a restless wind, and for many months now his thoughts had circled around a singular image, a boy's face, tear-streaked and uncertain, turned toward him in a moment of innocent trust. Not his son, not any kin by blood, a child he had wronged, and whose forgiveness had never been sought. His name was Samuel Pritchard, the son of a tenant who had once lived in the stone cottage near the West Wood. Walter had been in his 40s, then respected in the county for his stewardship of the estate and his judicious conduct on the local magistrate's bench. He prided himself on fairness, on adherence to the law, on what he called right order. But when a window was broken at the stables and a silver pocket watch went missing, the blame fell quickly, almost too easily, upon young Samuel. He had been seen loitering nearby, and the stablemaster, a man of short temper and rigid views, was quick to report suspicion. Walter recalled the hearing in the manor's library how the boy had stood small in his patched coat, clutching his cap in white-knuckled hands. He had spoken softly, denying the charge, but Walter had been firm. There must be consequence. He had said more to himself than to the boy. A lesson taught early is a life spared ruin. Samuel had been dismissed from the grounds, and his family, shamed and bitter, left Dunsmuir within the month. The watch was later found in the loft, where it had slipped between the floorboards. No apology was made. That was 27 years ago. And yet, the boy's face had not left him. In the months following Eleanor's death, Walter found himself walking more frequently by the stream. Once a place he had crossed with unthinking confidence, it now felt like a border between who he had been and who he had failed to become. The stream murmured to him, sometimes gently, sometimes with reproach. And always the same question returned: what is left undone? That day, beneath the summer house roof, the question took clearer form. With great care, Walter rose and made his way back to the main house. He entered the study, its oak panels, warmed by the sun, and sat before his writing desk. There, with his fountain pen and the green notepaper Eleanor had favored for correspondence, he began a letter. It was not elegant, but it was true. To Mr. Samuel Pritchard, wherever you may now reside, I write not in expectation, but in hope that these words may reach you and offer what I failed to give you before an honest apology. He wrote slowly with deliberation, recounting the incident, acknowledging his error, and confessing that the weight of silence had grown too heavy to bear. When he finished, he signed it with full name and trembling hand and placed the sheet in an envelope. He did not know where to send it. At the post office the next morning, Miss Everett, the clerk, looked at him over her spectacles. "Are you in need of assistance, Mr. Breckenridge?" "Yes," he said. "I'm seeking an address for a Mr. Samuel Pritchard. His family once lived at Dunsmuir Cottage." She pursed her lips. "The name is familiar. I believe he works for the railway now, somewhere near Ludlow. Shall I inquire for you?" Walter nodded. "Discreetly, if you please." 3 days later, she handed him the address. It was scrawled on a slip of brown paper. He posted the letter without hesitation. A fortnight passed with no reply. Walter returned to the summer house each evening, not in restlessness, but in resignation. He did not expect absolution. He did not even expect acknowledgement. It was enough, he told himself, to have spoken. But on the 15th day, a letter arrived. The envelope bore the mark of the Ludlow post. Inside, on plain-lined paper, was a message in steady, modest hand. "Dear Mr. Breckenridge, I was surprised to receive your letter. I had not thought of Dunsmuir in many years, though the place and time are woven into my bones. I thank you for your words. I bore no hatred, though I did carry sorrow. Life has been fair to me in other ways, and I hope it has been to you as well. Let us say no more of it. I wish you peace. Yours faithfully, Samuel Pritchard. Walter sat with the letter for a long while, the sun slanting across his knees. He folded it gently, placed it beside the watch that now lay in a velvet box in his drawer, and exhaled. Not in relief, but in release. Takeaway. When a wrong is carried in silence, it grows not only in memory but in the marrow. Yet to speak even late is to allow healing its chance. We may never reverse what has been done, but we may lighten the shadow it casts. Let the apology be sent, even if uncertain. Let the truth rise, even if years have passed. For in the quiet of evening, the soul knows when the ledger has been made whole. The sky above Allerdale Hollow bore the hush of mid-autumn, its light diffused through a veil of high clouds that spread like gauze across the heavens. Beneath this muted sky, Elizabeth Martin made her way along the path leading from the vicarage orchard to the narrow wooden gate at the edge of the parish grounds. She carried in her basket a small posy of anemones and late roses gathered with quiet care, the stems still damp from the morning dew. She paused beneath the twisted ash tree that marked the boundary of the older graves, the earth there uneven and softened with moss. There was a particular stone she always visited, not grand nor prominent, but modest and half-leaning, its inscription weathered by years of rain and time. It belonged to Mary Ellis, her childhood companion, whose life had been brief and whose departure had left a hollow in Elizabeth that had never been quite filled. She knelt slowly, her knees protesting, and placed the flowers gently on the stone's base. 37 years. She murmured, as though speaking to the moss rather than to any spirit. And still you visit me in dreams. Her voice did not tremble. It bore the calm cadence of one long familiar with sorrow, no longer raw, but weathered like the stone before her. The dreams had begun again, in recent weeks, gentle, strange, and unsettling in their clarity. Mary, always in the garden behind the old schoolhouse, hair tied with blue ribbon, humming some half-remembered melody, as though no time had passed. She never spoke in the dreams, only turned and smiled, and then walked away through the lilac hedge, always disappearing before Elizabeth could reach her. It was not grief that haunted her now. It was the question that remained. That afternoon, Elizabeth sat at her writing desk, the heavy oak one she had inherited from her father, who had once served as schoolmaster in Allerdale. The window beside her looked out upon the kitchen garden, where parsley and sage still grew in resilient clumps despite the chill of the season. On the desk lay a small journal bound in green cloth, its pages neatly filled with dates and lines of thought, a practice she had maintained for over 40 years. But today, she could not write. Instead, she opened the bottom drawer and retrieved an old letter folded many times, the creases worn thin. It was from Mary, penned in a careful hand, the summer before she died. The contents were simply an account of a walk, a new book, an invitation to tea, but what lingered was the final line: "I feel as though I shall not grow old. But if I do not, promise me you will remember something beautiful about Minot, what was broken." Elizabeth closed the letter and held it in her hands a while, as one might hold a leaf before placing it upon water. In truth, she had never spoken of Mary to others. The nature of their friendship, intimate, unspoken, forged in the subtle glances of girlhood, had never lent itself to public telling. It had lived in the spaces between days in letters, never sent in memories that drifted like smoke at dusk. She walked to the village library the following day, an errand half formed in her mind. The librarian, Miss Prudence Hale, greeted her with the quiet efficiency of someone who found greater solace in catalogues than in conversation. "I wondered," Elizabeth began, "if the school's garden records are still kept, from the old schoolhouse, the one before it burned." Miss Hale blinked. "There are a few boxes in the back room. May I ask?" "I believe something was planted there, a lilac hedge. It was Mary Ellis who did it. I would like to know if any trace remains." Miss Hale led her to the archives, and together they sifted through brittle ledgers and yellowing charts. At last they found a line entry from 1894 lilac eastern boundary of schoolyard, planted by Miss M. Ellis and Miss E. Martin. Elizabeth read the line 3 times. She made her way to the schoolhouse ruins that very afternoon. It stood now as a shell overtaken by ivy and lichen its stones warm with moss and memory. Children no longer played there. A new building had been erected closer to the main road. But the garden still existed, faint outlines the ghost of beds and borders. And there, half hidden by bramble, were the remains of the lilac hedge. She knelt beside it and brushed the soil with her gloved hand. The root was still alive barely, but holding on. A single green shoot pushed through the dry leaves, fragile as breath. She sat there for a long time, the wind rustling the hedge, the light waning above the trees. She did not speak aloud, but in her stillness, something stirred her presence, not spectral, but remembered. Mary in her blue ribbon, smiling without sorrow, without expectation. That evening, Elizabeth took up her pen. She did not write in her journal. Instead, she began a letter not to send, but to speak. "My dearest Mary, I found the lilac today. We planted it, do you remember? You insisted we use the deeper spade. I did not believe it would last. And yet, here it is, still stubborn, still reaching. I have kept many things in silence, but I no longer fear the telling. You were the one who taught me to notice the smallest things a bee, on a daisy the sound of larks before dawn. These things remain, and through them, so do you." She folded the letter and placed it beside the old one, binding them with a ribbon. Then she opened the window, letting in the chill air and the sound of leaves. In the weeks that followed, she returned often to the lilac hedge. She cleared the ground gently, brought water, and whispered fragments of poems as she worked. The shoot grew taller, and with it, a sense of something no longer left undone. She did not dream of Mary again, but the stillness no longer ached. Takeaway. Some memories visit not to haunt, but to be tended. When we meet them in quietude, not fear, we learn that the past seeks not to bind us, but to bloom again through remembrance. Let the hedge grow, let the silence soften, and let the beautiful remain. It was in the gentle hush of late spring that Margaret Dorrington sat upon the bench beneath the elder tree behind the rectory, her sewing basket at her side, and a letter open on her lap. The garden was still with the kind of stillness known only to English countryside. Morning, sir, stillness, not of silence, but of agreement between wind and grass, between bird and hedge, that there was no need to rush. Beyond the hedgerow, the village of Whittington lay soft and unchanged, its thatched roofs drowsing beneath a mild sun, and the distant bell of St. Aidan's marking the second hour before noon. Margaret, now 63, and accustomed to the quiet rhythm of her widowhood, had received few letters in recent months, none from the one she longed most to hear. The letter she held was not from her son Edwin, nor from her brother in Devon. It was from a woman in Yorkshire, whose name she recognized only faintly, to Miss Clara Norbury, who had written in a tone both formal and full of apology to say that her mother, Margaret's childhood friend Elspeth, had died 3 weeks earlier. No one had thought to write sooner. The letter was kind, factual, efficient in its telling. Elspeth had passed away quietly in her sleep, the result of a heart weakened by years and undiagnosed ailments. Her funeral had been held in a small chapel near Skipton, attended by a handful of neighbours. No flowers had been sent from Whittington, no message of farewell from Margaret. Margaret folded the letter with great care, as though the weight of it might slip through her fingers if she were not attentive. Her expression did not falter, but her hands moved with a gravity that betrayed a slow unravelling within. She had not dreamed of Elspeth in years, and yet 2 nights ago, without warning or prompt, Elspeth had come to her again, in sleep-young, vibrant laughter, on her lips, sitting beside her in the hayloft of their girlhood, speaking of lilacs and secrets. Margaret had awakened with a start, a kind of ache in her chest, not born of grief, but of something more fragile, a regret, rooted in the deep soil of forgotten letters and unspoken reconciliations. They had been inseparable once, she and Elspeth. From the age of 9 until 19, they had passed every idle hour together collecting bluebells, reading poetry aloud in the woods, behind the parsonage, whispering of love and fortune and all the futures they might inhabit. But there had been a quarrel, a misunderstanding, sharpened by pride, and the parting that followed was never mended. Elspeth had gone north to teach, then married a solicitor in Halifax. Margaret had remained in Whittington, marrying Edward Dorrington, the vicar's son, and raising a son of her own beneath the stone lintels of the same house where she herself had been born. They had not written in 31 years. She had told herself, as many do, that the past was best left folded, that if reconciliation did not arrive by the hand of time, then it was not fated to be. Yet the dream and now the letter spoke differently. Later that afternoon, Margaret made her way to the old footpath behind the churchyard. She walked with a measured step, her cane tapping softly upon the worn flints, the edges of her skirt brushing against the taller grasses that had grown wild since the last trimming. The path led to the lower meadow, where as girls, she and Elspeth had once buried a wooden box beneath the roots of a hawthorn tree. She could not remember what they had placed inside. Perhaps ribbons, perhaps a verse of Shelley, perhaps something altogether foolish. But the act itself had felt sacred at the time, a covenant. She reached the hawthorn and stood a while, letting the soft wind press through her shawl and raise the scent of loam and lichen from the earth. The tree had grown gnarled, its bark cracked, but still it flowered. Still it bore witness. She sat upon the flat stone near its base, the one they had used as a table in their play, and removed from her bag a slip of paper. She had written no letter, only a line from Herbert. She recalled from long ago, "Thou that hast given so much to me, give one thing more, a grateful heart." She read it aloud, not loudly, and tucked it between the roots where moss and root held secrets without judgment. That evening, as dusk folded gently across the fields and the swifts darted beneath the golden clouds, Margaret sat at her embroidery in the parlour. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock and the low purring of the cat upon the hearth rug. She paused, her needle still in hand, and looked toward the far corner of the room where a portrait of Eleanor, her late sister, hung in faded oils. "I believe I was wrong." she said softly. The admission was not to Eleanor. It was not to Elspeth. It was to the version of herself who had waited year after year for the reconciliation to come from elsewhere. The following Sunday, Margaret attended evensong. She sat in her usual pew, her posture straight, her gloves neatly folded in her lap. But when the moment for silent prayer arrived, she bowed her head more deeply than usual. And though no words passed her lips, her silence was fuller than ever before, not the silence of absence, but the silence of resolution. Takeaway. Some farewells arrive long after the parting, yet even unspoken reconciliations may flower in the heart that remains open. Let not pride delay what compassion would have hastened. A friendship left untended may yet be honored, not in reply, but in remembrance. Where words fail, presence remains. Let peace bloom where the quarrel was laid. The morning fog lingered over Gorsewell Green, like a forgotten thought, softening the outlines of the hedgerows and dulling the edges of the thatched rooftops. Even the rooks, usually clamorous above the yew trees, seemed subdued their wings, slicing silently through the mist. In the attic room of Ashley House, Thomas Fenwick adjusted the shutters with a deliberate hand and let in the grey half-light that rendered his canvases pale and spectral. He had not painted for many weeks, not in earnest. His easel stood bare, and the palette knives lay idle upon the window ledge. The tools were untouched, not from indifference, but from a slow accumulation of something unnamed, something neither sorrow nor fatigue, but their quieter cousin detachment. The room was unchanged since Edith's passing. Her embroidered cushion remained on the window seat, the needle still embedded in a square of unfinished hollyhocks. A jar of ochre pigment she had gifted him 2 Christmases prior sat unopened beside the brushes, its label faded. She had always been his critic, his guardian against indulgence, reminding him that shadows must serve the light, not eclipse it. Since her death the previous autumn, Thomas had spoken little. The village's decent folk kindly, if inquisitive, respected his silence and brought him plum preserves and seed loaves without waiting to be invited in. But grief had not brought wailing to Ashley House. It had brought instead a quiet rearrangement of time itself. The hours no longer beckoned forward, but curled inward, looping back into memory with unrelenting insistence. Each night he dreamt of Edith, not vividly, but insistently. Her presence hovered in the periphery, never speaking, never approaching. Always, she walked ahead of him, through unfamiliar terrain, a copse lit with bluebells, a vast moor, swept with bracken, or once a ruined abbey, with light falling through the broken arches. She never looked back, and yet he felt no abandonment, only the sense that she was leading him somewhere he could not yet follow. In the second drawer of his writing desk, Thomas kept a box of pastels. They were wrapped in silk and bore the patina of year seldom used, but never discarded. Edith had once remarked that she preferred the softness of pastels to oils, claiming they carried the breath of thought rather than the weight of conclusion. He opened the box that morning with a reverence usually reserved for relics. His hand hovered over the chalks of muted lavender and iron grey, unsure whether to choose or to remember. Then gently, he closed the lid. What drew him from the house that day was neither decision nor resolve, but an unspoken prompting, the kind that arises from rhythm rather than reason. He took his coat from the peg, tucked a sketchbook into its inner pocket, and stepped into the mist. The path behind the orchard led to Hallow's Copse, a modest wood where they had walked countless times over the years, sometimes in conversation, often in silence. It was Edith who had first introduced him to its peculiar geometry, the way the trunks formed triangles. When viewed from certain angles, how the branches interwove above like vaulted ceilings. He paused near the lichen-covered bench where she had once read aloud from Middlemarch, her voice cool and measured, carrying just enough irony to animate Dorothea without cruelty. The seat was damp now, and the ivy had begun to reclaim its legs. He walked on. Beyond the bench, the ground sloped down toward the stream that fed the lower marsh. There beside a fallen ash lay a stone, no broader than a loaf, yet flat and smooth, as if shaped by centuries of river speech. It had served as her easel once when she insisted on sketching the birches in winter light. The bones of trees, she had said, are nobler than their dressing. He took out his sketchbook, though his hands trembled more than he expected. His pencil traced lines without force, and he let it wander not to capture form, but to enter presence. A wren darted through the underbrush, and the air held the faint sweetness of thawed moss. What emerged on the page was not the copse, but Edith. Not her face, not precisely, just the impression of her seated posture, the suggestion of her gaze turned towards something unseen. He did not correct it. That evening, back in his attic room, Thomas sat before the empty easel. He had removed the dust cloth and let the blank canvas catch the last gold light slipping through the western panes. He did not intend to paint. He only watched. And as the shadows lengthened, he understood something, not as revelation, but as quiet assent. Edith did not appear in his dreams to pull him back. She appeared to help him carry forward that which she had loved most in him. His eye, his quiet tenacity, his reverence for what cannot be rushed. The dreams were not hauntings, but invitations. 2 days later, he returned to the copse. This time he brought the pastels. He worked slowly, kneeling on a folded blanket, his strokes tentative yet tender. He did not paint Edith. He painted the impression of where she had once been, the bench half covered in ivy, the birch trunks behind, the empty stone before them. The light changed as he worked, but he did not hurry. Each layer built upon the next like breath upon breath. He did not seek completion, only continuation. When the piece was finished, it could be called, so he did not sign it. He did not title it. He only placed it beside the others on the shelf, where it joined the company of those that had come before. Takeaway. Some faces remain not to anchor us in grief, but to guide us beyond it. Dreams are not always memories dressed in shadow. Sometimes they are invitations into stillness, into presence. Let the canvas remain open. Let the figure walk ahead, and know that in following gently, one does not leave love behind, but carries it into light. The frost clung stubbornly to the window panes of Briar Cottage, though it was nearly midday. Thin ribbons of sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, pale and unsure, like a memory trying to return. Inside, Margaret Elwood sat hunched in her nursing chair, one slipper hanging loose from her heel, her fingers curled around a cup of chamomile tea that had long since lost its warmth. The fire in the grate had settled to a faint orange glow, its rhythm like the breath of some hibernating beast. Margaret had not ventured into the village since Epiphany, not out of fear or frailty, but from a kind of solemn resolvia vow made to silence, to endurance. Each passing day added to that quiet ritual, and she felt herself withdrawing into a chamber within her soul, where memory rang louder than sound. It was not loneliness that bound her thus, but a question left unanswered. In the attic behind an old sea chest lay a letter creased at the corners, its seal long broken. The ink had faded, but the words had not. They belonged to her son Jonathan, who had perished 3 winters ago on the Eastern Front, a lieutenant in the Queen's Royal Fusiliers. The letter had arrived days after the telegram, like a ghost arriving late to its own wake. She had read it once, only once. Since then she had feared its gravity the way it beckoned her into its truths. Outside, the wind shifted scattering brittle leaves across the low garden wall. In the hedgerow, a robin alighted on the bare branch of a hawthorn tree. Margaret watched it for a time, the red of its breast, like a small flame against the grey of the world. Something in its stillness summoned her to her feet. She rose, with a slow deliberation, placed the teacup upon the mantel, and made her way to the stairs. Each step creaked in protest, the wood speaking the language of years. In the attic, dust hung in the air like the remnants of old sighs. The sea chest resisted at first its leather strap, stiff the brass hinge grown arthritic. But when it opened, it did so with a solemn gentleness, as if yielding at last to the inevitability of remembrance. The letter was where she had left it, beneath the folded wool of Jonathan's school blazer, still smelling faintly of lavender and old chalk. She held it in both hands, her fingers trembling not with fear, but with something older duty perhaps, or love's long shadow. She returned to the hearth and lit the fire anew. As the flames grew, she read. The letter spoke of the land, not the war. Jonathan wrote of a girl he had met in a village outside Thessaloniki, a girl named Eleni, who wore her hair in plaits and spoke English with a lilt like birdsong. He wrote of the olive groves of children laughing in the ruins of hope, blooming amid desolation. And then, in the final paragraph came the confession, Eleni was with child. He wrote not with fear, but with longing. He asked for Margaret's understanding, not her forgiveness for what he called a joining of fates neither planned nor regretted. He had not intended to love her, but he did. Margaret read the words aloud slowly like scripture. The room was very still. The fire crackled faintly, and somewhere in the garden a branch snapped under the weight of snow. That evening she walked to the vicarage. Reverend Alastair was a man of 63, with a face carved by prayer and time. He welcomed her with surprise, ushered her into the parlour where oil lamps bathed the room in amber quietude. She did not speak at first. Instead, she handed him the letter. He read it without haste, his lips moving silently, his brow furrowed, not with judgment, but with care. When he finished, he folded it once more and held it in both hands. "Did you ever try to find the girl?" he asked gently. "No," she replied. "I could not bring myself to know what I could not change." He nodded, as if to affirm the weight of her choice. "And now?" Margaret's gaze fell upon a cross-stitch framed above the mantel. "Thy will be done." Her voice was calm when she answered. "Now I feel the child is waiting, not for me perhaps, but for something only I can give." A week later, with the help of the Reverend and a letter to the Red Cross, the search began. It was slow, methodical, bureaucratic, but it moved, and with each passing day, Margaret found her limbs less stiff, her voice less shy. She returned to the village shop, lingered at the post office, even visited the memorial garden where Jonathan's name was carved into the black marble beside others claimed by war. And then in the early spring, word arrived. Eleni had died in childbirth, but the Childer boy named Tomashad survived. He lived with his great-aunt Maria, a teacher in a coastal town north of Athens. He was 9 now, fond of maps and poetry, and he had Jonathan's eyes. The journey to Greece was not easy. The doctors cautioned against it, but Margaret was unyielding. With the help of a kind woman from the Parisha widow named Helen, who had once been a nurse, arranged for travel, secured lodgings, and prepared herself for what waited. Maria received them warmly, though, with a grief still visible in the corners of her eyes. Thomas stood beside her, unsure, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. Margaret knelt slowly, her knees crackling with the motion. She did not reach for him. Instead, she spoke. "I am your grandmother." The boy said nothing, but after a long silence, he stepped forward and placed his hand on hers. For 2 weeks, Margaret stayed in the town. She visited Eleni's grave, walked with Thomas through the olive groves, and read to him in the evening tales of England, of foxes and moors and lantern-lit inns. She taught him to bake scones, and he taught her how to count to 10 in Greek. She did not speak often of Jonathan, but when she did, it was always in stories: how he once climbed the school roof to rescue a trapped owl, how he cried when his dog died, how he hated grey socks and always lost his pens. Thomas listened with the solemnity of one receiving inheritance. When the time came to leave, Maria placed something in Margaret's hands, a book of Jonathan's poems, copied by Eleni, in her own hand. Some were unfinished, others fragments, but in each was the echo of a voice still present in the world. On the final evening, as they sat beneath a sky alight with stars, Margaret took Thomas's hand. "Whatever sorrow brought us here," she said softly, "it has brought us also into grace. That too is the will of heaven." Take away time does not erase love, it asks, only that we carry it forward into new forms, new faces, even across oceans, even beyond death. The past is never lost when we choose to meet it not with despair, but with the courage to greet what remains. Love, when released from silence, becomes legacy. Let it be so. The mists over Wiltshire hung low that morning, as if the land itself were reluctant to wake. Clouds gathered like soft grey wool across the downs, and the lane that wound its way toward Old Marley Church was lined with puddles from the evening's rain. The bell tower stood solemn against the pale sky ivy creeping across its stones like age upon a brow. Beneath this weathered steeple, Evelyn Markham moved with steady feet and a quiet mind. In her left hand, she held a key-long iron and rusted with years, and in the crook of her arm was tucked a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and twine. She wore her mourning coat, though it was not a day of funeral, and her hat was adorned with a single white feather. The vicar had given her permission to enter the vestry alone, though he had offered to accompany her. Evelyn declined with a gentle but firm voice, saying only that some things must be faced in solitude. So now, at just past the 9th hour, she unlocked the ancient door and stepped inside. The vestry smelled of beeswax and old stone. A narrow shaft of light filtered through the high window, casting long shadows across the pewter crucifix and the wooden cabinet where she knew the records were kept. She laid the parcel upon the table, unknotted the twine, and unfolded the pages one by one. Inside was a bundle of letters, none her own. They had belonged to her late sister Constance. Constance Markham had been gone near 30 years, taken by illness in her prime. She had been the radiant one, the child of laughter and colour. While Evelyn chose books and long walks through autumn fields, Constance was drawn to music, to parties, to the flurry of the London stage. She had been a singer modest, but admired her name, appearing in small print beside lamplit theatres across Bloomsbury and Chelsea. And then, quite suddenly, she vanished from the playbills. Family law maintained that she had tired of the life-chosen rest in the countryside, grown weary of bright lights and false promises. Evelyn, who had cared for her in the end, knew there was more. There had always been more. Among the letters now spread before her were fragments of that buried tale. She read them slowly, tracing each line as if it might vanish under her gaze. There were 7 in all, written in a firm, dignified hand. The ink had faded the paper, foxed and brittle, but the meaning remained. They were from a man named Harold Trellinger, former magistrate, a widower of high regard, who had in his twilight years found solace in music and conversation. The tone of his letters was chaste yet intimate, filled with reflections on faith, solitude, and the condition of the soul. He spoke of Mozart as if he were a prophet and quoted Ecclesiastes with a kind of trembling reverence. In the final letter, he wrote of a child. He did not name him, but referred to the boy with unmistakable tenderness. He wrote of long walks in the garden of tales told by the fireside, of lullabies sung in secret. He spoke of a promise made to Constance that the child should never be burdened by the past, nor feel himself a mark of shame. That Evelyn, who had known sorrow and strength alike, might one day decide if that promise should remain. Evelyn folded the last letter and pressed her hand to her chest. She had known in some deep and silent place that Constance's illness was not the only cause of her retreat from the world. The child had been born in secrecy in a cottage near the Dorset coast and placed into the care of a kindly couple, distant cousins, who agreed never to speak of it. Evelyn had visited once, just once, under the guise of holiday, and met a boy with dark curls and eyes like her father's. His name was Thomas now. He lived scarcely 20 miles away, a man grown a schoolmaster with a passion for literature and early music. He did not know he was of her blood. Until today. When Evelyn left the church, the clouds had begun to part. She walked past the lich gate and down the sloping lane, where buttercups now pushed shyly through the grass. Her motor car waited by the green, and beside it stood a tall figure in a brown wool coat. Thomas looked every inch, the scholar spectacles perched upon his nose, leather-bound book in hand, the posture of a man too used to solitude to speak without thought. "Miss Markham?" he asked as she approached. "Yes," she replied, gently offering her hand. He took it, and for a moment neither spoke. The wind stirred faintly, lifting the edge of her scarf. "You said it was urgent," he said at last. "I did." Her voice did not waver. "And perhaps overdue." She led him to a bench beneath the great beech tree by the chapel wall. There, in the filtered light of spring, she gave him the letters. He did not read them immediately. Instead, he turned them over in his hands, studying the creases, the script, the weight of it all. Then, without a word, he opened the first and began. It took time. She watched the lines of his face change, perplexity, giving way to understanding, then to something softer, something neither grief nor joy, but an acknowledgement of both. When he reached the final letter, he closed it with reverence. "I always felt out of place," he murmured. as if something had been gently hidden from me, but kindly, not cruelly. Evelyn nodded. It was not silence born of shame, only caution and perhaps cowardice and time. He looked at her then, and in his gaze was not anger, but a quiet recognition. Was she happy? Not always, Evelyn admitted. But she loved deeply, and you were the proof of that. They stayed on the bench until the sun slipped low. She told him stories of childhood summers of music echoing down the stairs of their father's house of Constance, humming Schubert while hanging the washing. He listened as one might to a long missing chapter of his own novel. At dusk, they parted, not with the finality of strangers, but with the hesitant tenderness of those newly bound. That night, Evelyn sat by her fire, the last letter open on her lap. She no longer feared the weight of the past. In naming it, in passing it forward, she had lessened its burden. She thought of her sister's voice now stilled, and of the Boino, the man who carried her legacy in his quiet, inquisitive soul. The stars pressed closely to the windows, unblinking and bright, and somewhere deep in the heart of night, Evelyn Markham finally slept without dreams. Our lives are often shaped by what is not said, by letters unread, truths untold, silences preserved in the name of peace. But peace, when founded upon fear, is fragile. In this final chapter, Evelyn teaches us that it is never too late to set things right. What do you think? Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed your view of the past? Let me know in the comments below, and if this story moved you, please press like to show your support.